Is SaaS slowing down or is it maturing? What's happening to pricing models? Is AI a bubble about to burst or just going through the regular hype cycle? I invite two analyst colleagues, Ryan Morris and Seth Robinson, to join me today as we're going to wrestle with these questions. Welcome to the Business of Tech Lounge, the live version of the Business of Tech podcast. It's Wednesday, August 21st, 2024, and I'm Dave Sobel. We'll be taking questions and comments throughout the show, so make sure to put them in the chat. We're going to lean in on being interactive, so make sure to throw them into the chat area if you've got comments or thoughts you want us to react to. Now, I want to thank Sales Builder, our Patreon sponsor, whose support makes this show possible. Focus on your IT sales workflow with the power of automation and visit them at salesbuilder.com. That's BUILDR.com. And a reminder, I am distinctly watching that chat, and we want to hear from you. Now, let's set the groundwork a little bit. I've got three articles I want to talk about with you, the audience, first, and we'll bring on our experts. First, Vendor's SaaS report, which gave a little bit of information about what's going on in the marketplace. They're reporting that annual contract value, or ACV, has increased less than 4% quarter over quarter with SaaS spending. However, the year-over-year increase is significant at 33%. Q2's ACV is the highest quarterly ACV on Vendor since Q4 of 2022, when net new ACV was $29,000. Now, renewal ACV has remained relatively flat for the past year. This quarter, it decreased slightly quarter on quarter and year over year, indicating that buyers have an advantage in renewal pricing right now. And second, from CIO Dive, 9 in 10 surveyed companies admitted they can't trace at least 10% of their total cloud spend to the right source. Of the 39% of respondents with cost management processes in place, just over 1/4 have optimized software code, and less than half have enabled chargeback processes that deduct cloud spend from departmental budgets. And finally, from TechCrunch, the net retention reality in the market is evolving in a manner that appears pretty tough for software companies, both large and small. NDR rates are slipping all over the software landscape, meaning that a lot of software companies are seeing their growth rates decline, not due to their inability to sell to new customers, or not merely that problem, but because their existing customers are not buying as much as they used to. So let me bring on Ryan Morris, principal consultant at Morris Management and co-host on Killing It, and Seth Robinson, vice president of industry research from CompTIA. Guys, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us on, Dave.
Let's start with this headline here. SaaS, is it maturing, slowing down, or do we have a problem here? Do you guys have a particular take on what we're seeing?
I do. In fact, I will say this is two factors, right? Number one, the customer is maturing, as you've been indicating. When customers can't figure out what they're spending, where they're spending it, why they're spending it, that's not a problem with the model. That's a question of the buyer not being prepared for the model, not being professional about the way that they go about it. It is inevitable that the customer will, in fact, mature and learn not only to measure what they're doing effectively, but to control it. Now, when you hear controlling spend, from a customer's perspective, that sounds like value. From a vendor's perspective, I think this is the bigger issue. It feels like a threat to their growth because they almost believe, based on my experience, that growth is something that they are entitled to. I run a SaaS model. I can land and I can expand. Expansion should drive more revenue growth than land. And that's just my entitlement because I happen to deploy this business model. That's not true. You see, expansion will happen if the customer actually believes that they are getting value from the tools that they are paying for. If they're shrinking their spend, it's not because only the economic factors, it's because they don't believe they're getting more value out than cost that they are putting in. That happens in every economic cycle. And if we either don't deliver value or can't demonstrate that we are delivering value, then the answer is try harder. That's not the customer's fault for cutting the budget. That's on the vendor for needing to demonstrate and deliver real value.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that there are some issues with the model that are continuing to be worked out by a lot of end customers. I think the other thing that I would add is I step back a level and take a look at this. And ever since we started talking about SaaS, there was something that kind of stuck in my brain. And I think it finally kind of came out when we were talking more about emerging technology. We talk about SaaS as its own industry, sometimes from the vendor perspective side of it. And I think that there is good reasons for those discussions. But from an end user perspective, I don't think a CIO ever says, I have a SaaS strategy, right? They have a workflow strategy. They have applications that they need to plug in. And one thing that I don't think got pulled out in any of those articles, Dave, that you mentioned, but I think is part of the reality here is the SaaS model has led to an explosion in the types of software that people can get for the various parts of their workflow. We've all seen those pictures of here's what the Marcom, environment looks like. And for one, there are 17 categories that you didn't even know there were 17 categories of Marcom. And then inside each one of those categories, you've got so many different vendors that you have to break out the magnifying glass and start looking at them. And it's kind of questionable how much of that the market will bear, right? So for one, how much granularity do we need for every piece of the workflow? And then how much granularity can an end user even absorb as they're trying to digitize process, as they're trying to get their workforce to adopt all of these new ways of doing things? I think there are some realities in that rollout of all these products and this attempt to digitize every niche part of the workflow that are beginning to impact the market here, and I think very likely impacting these numbers that we're seeing.
All right. Now, you both said it in slightly different ways, and I want to ask about this. Seth, you just go, there's issues with the rollout. Ryan, you said that the buyer isn't ready. Am I blaming the solution provider here? Let's break this down, right? Whose job is it to get the buyer ready? Is it a matter of the SaaS provider, the software provider has to shoulder all of that? Isn't that what the integrator, deliverable, managed services provider? You kind of both said it in different ways. I'm saying this because I think there's an opportunity, but kind of where's the problem here and who should own the problem?
Well, I think in every example of a value chain that you've ever examined, it is a shared responsibility where your interest as the vendor and my interest as the solution provider cannot be separated because they can't be achieved independently of one another. If the software is good, but the implementation is poor, neither one of them is getting paid. If the vice versa is true, software is poor, but there's a brilliant implementation, eventually neither of those participants are actually going to get paid. It is on the seller to teach the customer how and why to buy the things the way we want to sell them and to enable them to do so successfully. Because otherwise, it's not the customer's job to figure out how to buy what you sell, or they'll just go buy something from somebody else, right? It's our job. If we want them to pay us, that we need to execute. Yes, that is on the vendor at the market and at the go-to-market strategy levels, but it is also on the implementer, on the solution provider to educate the customer, to support the customer, to actually demonstrate to them, this is what you bought, this is how much you paid for it, and then here's how much value you got in return. If we can't demonstrate that, don't blame the customer for saying, I don't see the value here. That's our job.
Yeah, I think there are maybe two different problems going on here, right? And one is if you're a vendor and you're creating this feature-rich piece of software for recruiting talent, is there a market for that? Is there enough of a market, for you to have a growth path? I think that all of the different niches that we're trying to carve out and all the features that we're trying to pack in each one of those niches, I struggle to believe that there's going to be enough appetite for all of these things, even in the medium to long term. And then when it comes to the integration, I think that's a joint problem, right? So you're not only selling your piece of software, you have to know how that interacts with the other pieces of software that are being sold by your competitors in the same space or other software providers that aren't competing in the same space, but they're part of that workflow. And I think some of that is on the vendor to be aware of that and to be able to kind of draw that out for the end user so that they understand that total cost of ownership or the total cost of implementation across that workflow. I would say maybe the lion's share that they could defer to a managed service provider or something like that. A vendor's not going to necessarily step in and be a consultant across that entire workflow, but some awareness of being able to point the customer in the right direction is probably going to go a long way.
Now, interestingly, I also, and Seth, I'm going to throw this to you first because in a way you may have already defeated my my basic premise here by saying, because you're right to acknowledge, SaaS isn't its own industry. It's interesting as you said that, as I was processing this, saying, yeah, he's right. We kind of break it out like it's an industry, but it isn't. It's a delivery model of software in various industries, which makes much more sense. But at the same time, I want to ask you your thoughts on some of these feel like symptoms of maturity that we've been doing this long enough that numbers can't grow forever. That's one of those basic economic problems is the bigger they get, the harder they are for growth. At some point, you have tapped into most of a end user's budget for solving a particular set of problems. So for example, the idea of I'm not going to continually buy more on my CRM software if I've solved that problem and it's delivered by SaaS. Yes, I'm going to see growth from users, but I may not necessarily see growth from other things because it's maturity. How much of this do you think is a symptom of maturity?
I think that the cost part of it is definitely tied to maturity. Ryan mentioned this earlier too, right? That we're still figuring out the cost structure across all cloud delivery models, SaaS, information or infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. We hear a lot, we read a lot about, companies that have to get more involved in FinOps or network administrators that have to get more involved in FinOps because they have to watch those costs in a much different way than they used to watch them when it was just capital expenditure, right? So I think that learning that cost structure is part of the maturing process. And I think another part of that maturing process is if you're a vendor and you're trying to pack more of these features in, and especially if they're AI features, which I think we're going to get to, then you're building more and more cost in the computation, the compute platform that you have to provide the software. And you're probably just not going to absorb all that cost. You're going to need to pass it along to the end user at some point. And they're eventually going to break. Again, if they've gone from 10 different applications to 100 different applications or something like that, and then every single one of those 100 applications starts ratcheting up the cost a little bit more, that becomes a huge problem for the end user, right? And I don't know that the vendors have a lot of levers to pull to control their costs. I think that's part of this overall market that everyone needs to understand. What is the overall appetite and the overall willingness to bear cost across our entire architecture and our entire workflow?
Well, interestingly, that article from CIO Dive exactly highlighted what you're just talking about in terms of managing costs. Now, we could spend a ton of time there, but I actually you brought up AI. It was coming shortly, and I wanted to link that trend to what we're talking about. And I want to actually talk a little bit about pricing models around AI. And we're going to ask the question, is per seat broken? Now, I'm going to borrow from a newsletter that I highlighted on last week's Weekend Big Ideas section, where I dug into this particular article that talks about the various ways that we can go to market and focusing on the fact that in a world of AI, it may be broken. And quoting the article, in a world like this, where seats may reduce or in some cases be completely orthogonal from the value created by SaaS, it's clear there will be very least be some additions, if not whole wholesale changes in pricing models. Now, the premise here is that if you think about AI, one of the big cost pieces is the fact that compute and the cost of the query is much more important. And so you can't necessarily let all the users in and charge per user or per seat, because your cost is compute. Now, as we infuse AI into everything, as we make data analytics much more powered by AI, I'm going to ask you both, like, are we about to truly break the pricing models that we've been using in a SaaS world for the past 10 or 15 years?
Yes. And in fact,
Okay.
I think those of us who have lived through the evolution of managed services could see this coming from a while ago. When we were born as MSPs, we looked around and said, well, how many users do you have? And what work will I do for them? And A times B equals the actual monthly recurring cost. And then we realized, you know what? A lot of the value we provide is not for the user. It was in the infrastructure. It was in the systems and the platforms that were under administration. And you couldn't just say, this is the cost per server, because a server in isolation doesn't do anything. You successfully managed the server. Congratulations. But the network was down. It's kind of like having a great car that doesn't have any gas in the tank, right? We evolved to look at a different way of pricing. And I believe that is what will happen with SaaS. We spend a tremendous amount of time in hard goods industries, right? Think about manufacturing, industrial production, fuel and oil and energy, right? All of these kinds of environments where the value to the organization is not found in terms of the number of seats of people who administer those systems. It's the factory floor. It's the OT as well as the IT. And we will have to be prepared to demonstrate not just that we can provide value, but what is the unit measurement. We can't just go to a customer and say, you've got 4 admins and each one of those costs $100,000 a year. They will puke on us, right? We have to be able to say, this is your organization. And as Seth described, this is the workflow that is being improved. Here is the measurable, tangible value to your organization as a result. This is how much you should pay to receive that value.
Yeah, Dave, you asked the question of, whether AI was going to change the pricing model that we've been seeing in SaaS, but I think Ryan kind of pulled it out a little bit there. I mean, this is the pricing model that we had prior to SaaS, just talking about managed services, right? It was like, how many seats, how many units am I serving here? And within a managed services discussion, we've been having a talk for quite a while now about outcome-based pricing. And I think we see this internally for end users. A CIO has to be thinking strategically now and has to be thinking about, what am I delivering? Because there's more investment happening in technology. The company, the organization realizes that they want to invest more to go through digital transformation, or to be more on the cutting edge, or to accelerate adoption of emerging technology. But it can't just be that I kept the lights on anymore. I have to be producing some kind of number, and it's not always going to be an ROI number, especially with something like cybersecurity. There's not going to be a return on that, but there have to be new metrics, and I think that that's what we're talking about here. Is what are the new metrics of technology and the technology purchase and procurement process? As we're starting to talk about AI, I do think that AI is changing some of that. I also think that AI is providing pretty convenient air cover for companies who are looking at it and saying, oh, geez, we went crazy on the number of seats that we handed out to people, and we're going to ratchet back on that now. We can run leaner, maybe not reducing workforce, but just reducing the number of people that have to hold these licenses. And they can say that there's AI and that makes them sound smarter, and maybe there is really some AI happening, but I think there's also just kind of this right sizing of some investments that went a little out of control.
Well, interestingly, I literally just covered a story on the show last week where the use of the phrase AI actually reduces the likelihood of a buyer because they are become much more skeptical of the product. So there's a certain degree of, like, don't lean too much into AI. the reason I wanted to bring up this conversation, particularly for listeners, is I don't think this is an imminent problem. I don't think that this is something that's looming in, say, the next quarter or two. But I do think we want to collectively, as an industry and some thought leaders here, to open this conversation of I think we're going to end up in a place where some of this compute power and the way you pay for it won't match the way the channels put this together now. If we think about AI delivered from, say, an OpenAI or an Anthropic, the way that it's delivered based on compute and it's billed through as compute, that kind of gets broken the moment you immediately try and turn that into per user pricing. Somebody like Microsoft, well, they can absorb that with Copilot, but your typical small and mid-market service provider is not going to be able to absorb that. And I think they're going to have to start thinking about a consumption model that looks a little bit more like like that compute model. But let me ask then for you guys, as you're starting to gaze into your crystal balls, how much do you think users are going to be kind of turning up and down the usage of AI in the way that we might think about it from the way a developer might use it? Or how much do you think it's going to be much more of a really static, definable thing that's delivered within a product? Seth, you want to dive in there?
Yeah, you and I talked about AI, I think, on a previous, lounge show. I've been looking at it for a while. I think that we've had AI, around for several years, not just the past couple with generative AI. Companies have been playing around with it. They've been learning. And ultimately, I think a lot of AI is just going to come as a feature of software that companies are already buying. They're not going to buy AI specific software. Most companies are not going to be building their own LLMs or writing their own algorithms, right? AI is going to be baked into your CRM and your finance software and your business productivity. It already is in a lot of cases, right? And if that's the case, then AI is maybe not just another feature. Maybe it's one of the biggest, best features we've had in a while, but it is another feature, right? And this almost makes me think back to when we talked about, 5G so much, and everyone was like, look at what we can do with 5G. And I would always say, well, what are you currently doing with 4G, right? Like everything that you're talking about is great, but it's theoretical, right? And it should build on top of what you're doing. And so back to our previous conversation, if we are already wrestling with feature-rich software packages where users aren't using all the features, how well are they going to be able to unlock that AI, right? And maybe the AI does some of it for them so that they don't have to be reaching in and doing it or prompting it or doing whatever. But if it's just another feature, we're already dealing with features that are kind of laying by the wayside, dead. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out.
See, I buy that philosophy completely. You can't say that there's value in AI, just like you can't discreetly say that there is value in compute or in storage or in any other independent functionality, discrete capability of a piece of technology. The question we must always come back to is to accomplish what? Right? From the business's perspective, what exactly am I using compute or AI to accomplish? If I'm using that to close my books faster at the end of the month and I can get more accuracy with less manpower and I can give more confidence to my investors because I've used AI to enhance the way I analyze and calculate my financials, cool. That means you got better at financials, not that you got better at AI. It's the same in any of the functional things that we do. And Dave, to tie these things together for you, I don't believe compute is the value that people think that it is. Just like electricity in the original utility model is not in itself a valuable commodity. What are you using it for? What will be the outcome that it accomplishes in your organization? Are you using it to run a factory floor? Are you using it to power the lights in the office, to heat the actual facility? Electricity on its own is necessary, but it does not equal value. The same is true for compute. The same is true for AI. What are you actually trying to do? You said, I think we need to get to the idea of a consumption model. I think once and for all, we need to get to the idea of an outcome model. where people are not paying us for the inputs that we deliver, but rather for the outcomes that we enable them to achieve. There's risk in that. That's why we're not there yet. People are a little bit afraid of that idea because, what if my technology doesn't produce value? The customer might actually stop paying me for it. Welcome to the real world. If it doesn't provide valuable outcomes that are recognizable, why would we pay extra for those things?
Well, in risk, there is the reward. So those that are going to start figuring that out are going to do something. Now, I'm gonna ask this because it's the question that's kind of dominating the news cycle, and I figured I'd let us all the way in on this one. Let's look at whether or not we're actually about to hit an AI bubble, or are we in the natural hype cycle? I'm going to pull from CNN on this one, which actually had a great article covering this whole space. Quoting from the article, in short, investors' fears can be boiled down to this. Is all of this actually worth anything? Or is it just another shiny object the industry is chasing to bring back its dreams of endless growth before it abandons it and moves on to the next big thing? Guys, I got my answer, but I want to hear from you first. Are we hitting an AI bubble, or is this the natural hype cycle?
Yeah, I'll jump in first because in our Outlook report at the end of last year, our very first trend was that AI hype is going to fade, but workflows are going to continue evolving. And the first half of that prediction is like the easiest prediction ever. AI hype is going to fade. Yeah, eventually, sometime it will. Like it always happens. It has to happen, right? People have made entire industries on the fact that, hype rises and then it falls. So it is going to fall. I think the question really is, what's that plateau at the end, right? And so I think, media, who was largely responsible for pumping this thing up in the first place, is really quick to say, hey, we're not seeing anything out of this. I think when you dig in and you talk to people that have been using this for years, not just, 2 years ago when ChatGPT came out, they are finding ways to transform their workflows. They're finding ways to improve their outputs. They might not be finding all the ways to measure that delta quite yet, but institutionally, it's working for them. And as a technology team, they can see that they're making progress. They probably need to make sure that they're communicating that as well as they need to the business side of the house. But I think that there is some real value in this. It was always going to be less than what the bubble got pumped up to. So there's a timing question of, when do we kind of go over the top and really start having some disillusionment? And then there's an ultimate plateau value of what is this really going to look like? And that plateau even has some timing in it, right? It's not like we're going to get to 2 years down the road and everyone has figured this out. We just talked about the fact that companies are still trying to figure out the costs of cloud computing. And that's a topic that I think I talked about 8 or 10 years ago at conferences, right? So these things take time. Like as much as there can be rapid change and rapid improvement in compute capability, there can be really slow change in behavior. And I think that's how it's going to play out for a little while here.
Ryan?
We have seen this movie before, and we can predict what the second act is going to look like. I remember a day when there was a headline that said, is there really any value in this newfangled technology called e-commerce, or is it just a shiny object that the industry wants to sell to you? If you'll recall, it took Amazon more than 10 years to arrive at profitability, and there were oodles of articles written during that period that question fundamentally whether they ever would. Kind of think it worked out okay for those guys over there, right? Same with Uber, same with every other new technology that has eventually achieved maturity. Now, let's be grown-ups, right? Not every technology that is launched makes it through the trough of disillusionment and back up to the plateau of profitability. Some things are fake. Some things are just hype and not anything meaningful beyond that. But every technology that has ever gotten to maturity had its period of disillusionment where people said, I'm just not quite sure about that. I'm not seeing the value here. Well, that's not just a technology seller's problem. That's a user skill problem. If you give me a circular saw, I know how to turn it on, but I don't know how to do much more than that with it. But that doesn't mean it's not a valuable tool, because there are plenty of people with skills and training who use that same tool to accomplish remarkable outcomes. What are we actually trying to accomplish with AI? And what are the skills that are necessary to actually empower the users to accomplish those outcomes? I'll say it again here, like we've said it before. I don't believe AI is anywhere near the concept of replacing humans, but it will enhance the capability of humans who spend the time and energy to get good at it. It is in its natural hype cycle. We get to sound like geniuses when we say, oh no, things might be a little bit bleak for a while. Will any of these vendors ever achieve profitability? Not tomorrow, not in any of the next couple of quarters, because that's just not how markets of transformative technology are created. It goes up the hype cycle, it comes down the disillusionment cycle, and eventually we grow up and we learn how to use it effectively. Case study, Amazon, right? Like, I think that there are enough smart people working on AI that we will find valuable uses and outcomes to be achieved. It's just not there yet. Doesn't mean it's broken, just means it's new.
I love that both of your answers are couched in value to the end user and to the the providers doing it. I'm going to observe it. I'm going to cheat a little bit with my answer and say the answer is yes. It is both a bubble to be burst, because the lens of that is generally investors who are looking for, they love hype or they love drop, right? Because it's a buy or a sell opportunity. So from that perspective, yes. And it is also the natural hype cycle. The technologies go through exactly the cycles that you talk about. And what is the trick for us as solution provider advisors, the group, the three of us and such, is to provide insights for the providers. That's why we want to look at use cases as heavily as we do. By the way, preview for those of you that are listening live, there's a ton of use cases on today's episode of the Business of Tech as I dive into a couple of specific ones. But it is also a bubble when we think about it from an investor perspective. Guys, this has been super fun, and I appreciate you joining me to mix it up. And I look forward to having you both on for some conversations on these live shows upcoming.
Let's do it. Thanks for having us, Dave.
Thanks for having us.
This has been great, guys. Thank you both for joining, and we will have both Seth and Ryan on again on future ones. Now, I want to give you a preview of an upcoming interview that's dropping this weekend. I spoke with Jonathan Romley, who's an expert on hiring, and he's written a book on international hiring. It's called Winning the Global Talent War: How to Find the World's Best Employees and Thrive in a Competitive World. We talked about the incoming deluge of resume applications, among other things. And here's a preview of his comments. Well, we're having a little bit of issues with the audio on this one, but I will make sure that you get access to that, and know that that video is available right now. My Patreon supporters already have this video if you want to listen now. Jonathan dove into how the deluge may actually be a new way for users to be hacked and to get the organizations with a flood of those uncertain and unknown resumes. And he talks in the interview a little bit about techniques and changes he thinks makes a big difference in recruiting. That interview will drop on YouTube and the podcast feed this weekend. And if you're interested, I encourage you to listen. You can get access to it early now at patreon.com/MSP Radio. Now, I want to thank Sales Builder, our Patreon sponsor, whose support makes this show possible. Focus on your IT sales workflow with the power of automation and visit them at salesbuilder.com. That's BUILDR.com. And vendors, you too can get your name mentioned on the live show. It's a simple monthly subscription. Visit patreon.com/MSP Radio to learn more. And listeners, you can support the show. The best way to do that is like, share, and follow on your favorite platforms. If you let someone know about the show, it's the #1 thing you can do to help. And you can support directly with our Give What You Want model. You set what you think the content is worth, and you get access to interviews early, access to one-on-ones with me, and special content drops periodically. If you have a question and are listening to the recording, send it in at question@mspradio.com. Thanks for joining me for the Business of Tech Lounge, and I will see you next time.